Okay, this is going to be an overview of Chapter 11. This chapter will cover marijuana. Now, unfortunately, we find ourselves in a similar situation that we saw in earlier chapters, where sometimes these chapters have so much information and a variety of sections all packed into one chapter that I just don't have the ability to cover everything due to time constraints. And so, that I just don't want these videos to go on endlessly. I want to keep them somewhat compact. And so that's the case with this chapter, that there's just too much. And so really the last several pages of this chapter, I'm just not going to have time to cover. That includes the sections on endocannabinoids, short and long-term effects of marijuana, the gateway drug hypothesis about marijuana, patterns of use, the case for medical use of marijuana, and then the final sections where they talk about legalization, decriminalization, and sort of the state versus federal question. That's a lot of stuff. So I'm going to have to leave it to you folks to make sure and cover that material. Again, what you want to look for testing purposes are just key terms. Number one thing you want to cover, and just look for big points, big picture items. But if you cover the material closely, I try to frame questions so that someone who's read the material closely is going to be able to get the answer. That's at least my attempt. So that's what this chapter is going to go like, and just make the best of it. Let me know if you have any questions about particular sections. I know the one other thing that I wanted to also say in terms of what to focus on and what's most important. Again, in this chapter, we have several pages dealing with the history of marijuana, and particularly the history of marijuana in the United States. I'm not going to stress that because, again, I'm more concerned with sort of the current situation, the current problem of drugs, and it's kind of a practical concern, just more concerned with what's going on right now than the history of it. So that's something that you can sort of, in trying to prioritize, that's not going to be a priority when it comes to testing. Okay, so let's jump into this material on marijuana. This first point here is that the pharmacological effects of marijuana are unique. It's not easy to place marijuana within a classification of psychoactive drugs. So that is certainly true. That you'll find we really haven't covered in this class sort of what are the major categories of drugs. I have stressed the sort of stimulants versus depressants, the type of drugs that crank up your system, say for example cocaine or meth, or drugs like the various opioids, for example, that depress your system or that slow it down. That's probably, if we had to come up with two major distinctions, it would probably be those, stimulants versus depressants. But we haven't really talked about hallucinogens much, for example, LSD. And that's another major category. Marijuana doesn't really clearly fit into any of these major categories that I just listed. Marijuana does have some excitatory effects, but it is not generally regarded as a stimulant. It's not thought of as being similar to cocaine or meth, something like that. It produces some sedative effects, but a person faces no risk of slipping into a coma or dying. So it doesn't have properties like opioids that are so heavy in making you relaxed and sleepy that they can shut down your system and cause coma or an overdose, a lethal overdose. Marijuana doesn't have those properties. It produces mild analgesic effects, meaning pain-reducing effects, but it is not related chemically to opioid drugs. So again, it has, you can find similarities, but they're not that similar to any of these. Marijuana is not that similar to any of these other major categories of drugs. So it really is unique and sort of its own. It does produce hallucinations at high dosages, but its structure does not resemble LSD or any other drug formally categorized as a hallucinogen. Marijuana is clearly a unique drug in a league of its own. Marijuana is frequently referred to as a synonym for cannabis, but technically the two terms need to be differentiated. Let's differentiate those. Cannabis is the botanical name for the hemp plant, Cannabis sativa. With a potential height of about 18 feet, cannabis has sturdy stalks, four-cornered in a cross-section, that have been commercially valuable for thousands of years. Again, we won't get into the history too much, but it has been used for a very long time in the manufacture of rope, excuse me, twine, sailcloth, and containers of all kinds. So this use of it for rope and related properties, fabric sort of properties, is a very old tradition going way back. Pots made of hemp fiber discovered at archaeological sites in China date the origins of cannabis cultivation. So here we're talking about growing cannabis domestically back to the Stone Age. It is arguably the oldest cultivated plant that isn't used for food. So again, used more for its fibrous nature. So this indeed is an old product for human beings. Now, but if we're talking about the psychoactive properties, the psychoactive factor is contained in a sticky substance or resin that accumulates on the leaves of the plant. Depending on the growing conditions, cannabis will produce either a great amount of resin or greater amounts of fiber. So those are sort of the two major contrasting things that have been useful, that have been desired from the plant. And you can see an interesting contrast that they tend to produce more of one or the other. They tend to be stronger on the fiber producing element of the plant, or a plant could be better, stronger at the resin producing part of the plant. So they tend to run sort of in opposite directions there. Fiber versus resin. In a hot, dry climate such as in North Africa, the fiber content is weak, but so much resin is produced that the plant looks as if it's covered with dew. So that's what you tend to get in a hot, dry climate. In a cooler, more humid climate, or moderate climate like North America, like the United States, or certain regions of the United States, less resin is produced, but the fiber is stronger and more durable. As many as 100 separate chemical compounds called cannabinoids have been identified from cannabis resin. So we're not talking about one compound here. We're talking about sort of a family of compounds closely related and that are given the overall term of cannabinoids. As many as 100 different compounds. The best known of these cannabinoids, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, was identified in 1964, and it is the classic quote-unquote compound that produces the intoxicating effects of cannabis. So this is the classic compound. When you hear discussions of marijuana, you'll often hear this term THC referring to the psychoactive compound found in this plant. So if I do in the rest of the lecture, if I do say THC, that's what I'm referring to, is this psychoactive element that's kind of the classic compound that produces the high. But again, it's just one out of many cannabinoids. The psychoactive characteristics of cannabis sativa is directly related to the concentration of THC. It's one major factor we want to stress here, is how concentrated is the THC. More concentrated, then of course the high experienced will be stronger, more intense. More recently, another cannabinoid, this one's hard to say, cannabidiol, or CBD, has been identified with properties quite different from that of THC. So again, these are related products, but they don't have precisely the same effects. but this is, again, a more recently developed or identified cannabinoid. Cannabis products are categorized in terms of two major factors. Number one, the resin content in the cannabis that is cultivated, and two, the relative concentration of the THC that is extracted from the resin. So we're talking, number one, resin, how much resin is there, and how concentrated is the THC in that resin. Those are two separate factors. The best known cannabis product, marijuana, consists of leaves and occasionally flowers of the cannabis plant that are first dried and then shredded. During the 60s and 70s, the typical THC concentration of street marijuana imported from Mexico was about 1 to 2%. Now, this is a theme that I want to stress strongly in this chapter and make a bigger point about it, this issue of drug concentration. Notice how in the past, we're talking about a low percent, 1 to 2% concentration. Since the early 90s, THC concentrations have steadily risen to 5 to 10% or higher, due primarily to advanced outdoor and indoor cultivation methods. Like you often see in agriculture, people are able to design plants, engineer plants, evolve plants over time that have more of the desired properties. And in the case of marijuana, it's the THC that's the desired product, and so people have been able to raise different strains that produce higher concentrations of THC. And so this is an important part of the story here is increased concentration. And the theme that I have not stressed enough in this course is that's what you see with kind of drugs in general, is over time they've evolved to be more potent, to be pure, to be more concentrated. That's the overall tendency due to, it can be agricultural techniques, it can be laboratory techniques that cause a purer and purer form of the drug. And that is problematic. On the one hand, the drug user gets what he or she desires, which is a stronger high. But the negative consequences of that is that you tend to get you just get more negatives when you have stronger concentrations. The drug tends to become more addictive, becomes more likely for overdose, for problems because of the high intense levels of concentration. The negative effects of the intoxication, becoming too intoxicated where it affects behavior, happens with increased concentrations. Now, actually, I'm stressing this issue of concentration in not the best chapter, because these negative things are less true of marijuana than they are, say, of cocaine or say of opioids. Cocaine's a really good example. I should have stressed this more. Again, in the chapter on cocaine, the problem always is time, but cocaine's a good example of that, because when that drug was used anciently, where folks would get coca leaves, just raw, unprocessed coca leaves, chew on those, and get a mild high of the cocaine. Concentration was very low. The drug was very diluted in its natural form. But as time has passed, technologies have developed, lab science has developed, cocaine has become purer and purer and purer, with stronger levels of intoxication. And in the case of a drug like cocaine, which is addictive, it becomes highly addictive. It becomes more problematic. You have a greater risk of overdose because of these increased concentrations. So due to technology, that's my big point here. Due to technology, concentrations have become stronger and stronger. And with some drugs, that's a real problem. With marijuana, less so, because marijuana does not have as intense negative consequences or side effects as do some of these other drugs we've been talking about. Marijuana smoked as a cigarette is the form of cannabis most familiar to North Americans. Of course, by North Americans, we're saying basically United States, Canada. Sometimes Mexico gets included in can get included in when we're referring to North America as well. A more potent form of marijuana is obtained by cultivating only unpollinated or seedless portion of the cannabis plant. Without pollination, the cannabis plant grows bushier. The resin content in the leaves is increased, and that results in a greater THC concentration. And it can be the greater concentration is achieved in this form, where we use this technique of no pollination. When there's this no pollination, and so no seeds, this form is called sin semilla, which is Spanish for without seeds. So again, the purpose here, the goal, greater THC concentration. Let's see, we're 16 minutes into this. Let's take a break. We'll pick it up in part 2.